Jung discovered something in 1919 that changed everything he thought he knew about human nature. Hidden beneath the surface of seemingly perfect people, he found a darkness so profound that it could destroy entire families, workplaces, and communities without leaving a trace. This wasn't just another psychological theory. This was a warning about predators who walk among us, wearing the mask of perfect empathy. Before we dive into this disturbing psychological revelation that Jung himself called his most terrifying discovery, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This knowledge might be the most important thing you learn about human nature, and it could save your relationships, your career, maybe even your life. Because what Jung uncovered in his clinic wasn't just academic research. It was a survival guide for recognizing the most dangerous people you'll ever encounter. This wasn't just another case study for Jung. This was the discovery that made him question everything he believed about the human psyche, about love, about the very nature of consciousness itself. The patient who walked into his clinic seemed ordinary, even admirable, but what Jung uncovered would haunt him for decades and change psychology forever. Wilhelm Steiner arrived at Jung's clinic in Zurich on a cold morning in February 1919. Jung was still recovering from his own psychological crisis, the period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. He was documenting his visions and dreams in what would become the famous Red Book, trying to understand the depths of his own mind. Jung was vulnerable, searching, open to new understanding, which made what happened next even more shocking. Wilhelm appeared to be everything Jung admired in a patient: might articulate, successful, seemingly self-aware. He was a prominent businessman who claimed to seek Jung's help for what he described as relationship difficulties. He spoke eloquently about his desire to understand himself better, to become a more loving husband and father. His words were poetry. His concern seemed genuine. His motivation appeared pure. Jung noted in his private journal that Wilhelm possessed an unusual quality. He seemed to absorb every word Jung spoke, processing it with remarkable intensity. But something felt fundamentally wrong from that very first session. Jung couldn't shake the feeling that he was speaking to someone who wasn't really there. As if Wilhelm's body was present, but his soul was somehow absent. During their first session, Wilhelm described his marriage to Anna with touching detail that would make any therapist believe they were dealing with a deeply caring husband. He spoke of her beauty, her kindness, her devotion to their family. He painted himself as a man struggling to be worthy of such love, someone who recognized his own flaws and desperately wanted to become better for the woman he claimed to adore. But as Jung listened more carefully over the following weeks, he began to notice something that made his blood run cold. Wilhelm never actually described Anna as a person with her own inner life, her own dreams, her own autonomous existence. He described her functions, how she made him feel important, what she provided for him, how she reflected his own significance back to him, like a mirror designed solely for his validation. When Jung asked Wilhelm to tell him about Anna's dreams, her fears, her individual hopes and aspirations that had nothing to do with their marriage, Wilhelm looked genuinely confused. It was as if the question made no sense to him, as if Jung had asked him to describe the inner life of a piece of furniture. The confusion in Wilhelm's eyes wasn't fake. It was the authentic bewilderment of someone who had never considered that other people might have autonomous inner experiences. Write in the comments, "I know this feeling," if you've ever felt like someone was studying you rather than knowing you, cataloging your responses rather than connecting with your humanity. Jung decided to probe deeper into Wilhelm's psychological landscape, hoping to find some crack in what was beginning to feel like an elaborate performance. He asked Wilhelm about his childhood, his relationship with his parents, his early friendships and formative experiences. What emerged over dozens of sessions was a pattern that made Jung's hands shake as he wrote his clinical notes. Wilhelm had no genuine memories of emotional connection with anyone, ever. Every relationship he described was purely transactional. What he had gained, what he had achieved, how others had served his needs or enhanced his status. When Jung pressed him for memories of love, loss, vulnerability, or genuine intimacy, Wilhelm would pause for long moments before producing what sounded like quotes from romance novels or philosophical texts about love. But the most chilling part wasn't Wilhelm's emotional emptiness. It was his complete, unshakable conviction that he was a loving, empathetic person who cared deeply about others. He wasn't consciously lying or trying to deceive Jung. He genuinely believed his own narrative with the absolute certainty of someone describing the color of the sky. Jung realized he was dealing with something far more dangerous than simple selfishness, narcissism, or even sociopathy. Wilhelm possessed what Jung began to call emotional mimicry, the ability to perfectly replicate the signs and sounds of genuine emotion without actually experiencing anything real beneath the surface. He had studied love the way others study mathematics or foreign languages, learning to perform it with mechanical precision that could fool almost anyone, including himself. Jung tested this theory systematically over several months of sessions. He would describe hypothetical scenarios involving moral dilemmas, emotional pain, ethical conflicts, or situations requiring genuine empathy. Wilhelm's responses were textbook perfect, exactly what a caring, thoughtful person should say. His vocabulary was rich with emotional intelligence terminology. His insights seemed profound. His compassion appeared limitless. But Jung noticed something that made his hands shake as he wrote his clinical notes after each session. Wilhelm's responses followed predictable patterns regardless of the specific scenario presented. He had memorized scripts for empathy, cycling through them like a player piano rolling through its repertoire. When Jung varied the situation slightly or introduced unexpected elements, Wilhelm became confused, sometimes giving completely inappropriate responses that revealed his fundamental inability to actually feel what others were experiencing. Even more disturbing was Wilhelm's reaction when Jung pointed out these inconsistencies. Instead of defensive anger or embarrassment, Wilhelm showed genuine curiosity about his own responses, as if Jung were explaining fascinating facts about a stranger. He seemed interested in improving his performance rather than understanding his authentic feelings, because there were no authentic feelings to understand. But Jung's real horror began when he started observing Wilhelm's impact on the people around him, starting with his wife Anna. Anna had been vibrant, creative, socially engaged when she married Wilhelm 2 years earlier. Friends from that time described her as someone with strong opinions, infectious laughter, and a gift for making others feel truly seen and understood. She had been studying art, writing poetry, actively involved in social causes that mattered to her. But by the time Jung began working with Wilhelm, Anna had transformed into something else entirely. She began showing up to social gatherings, looking increasingly hollow, her eyes bright but somehow empty, her smile perfect but mechanical. Friends noticed she had stopped talking about her own interests, her own thoughts, her own dreams. When directly asked about her well-being, she would deflect with that bright, empty smile and redirect the conversation to Wilhelm's achievements, Wilhelm's insights, Wilhelm's needs. Jung arranged to meet with Anna separately, telling Wilhelm it was standard procedure for his treatment method. What he discovered during those sessions made him seriously consider ending the treatment entirely, and warning Anna to leave her marriage immediately. Anna had changed completely in the 2 years since marrying Wilhelm, but the transformation had been so gradual that she couldn't identify when or how it had happened. She described feeling constantly confused about her own emotions, second-guessing every reaction she had, doubting her own perceptions to the point where she felt like she was losing her mind. Wilhelm had developed a way of explaining Anna's feelings to her that always made more sense than her own direct experience. When she felt sad, Wilhelm would gently explain that she was actually experiencing gratitude but didn't recognize it. When she felt angry, Wilhelm would compassionately point out that she was really feeling fear and help her understand why. When she felt lonely, Wilhelm would lovingly demonstrate how she was actually feeling overwhelmed by too much connection. His explanations were so logical, so compassionate sounding, so articulated with psychological sophistication, that Anna found herself apologizing for having the wrong emotions. Gradually, she had stopped trusting her own perceptions entirely, and began depending on Wilhelm to tell her what she was really feeling, what she really wanted, who she really was. Jung recognized this as a form of psychological colonization. Wilhelm was systematically replacing Anna's inner emotional life with his version of what she should feel, think, and experience. But the most disturbing part was that Anna couldn't see it. She described Wilhelm as the most understanding husband imaginable, the only person who truly knew her, her psychological savior who had helped her understand herself better than she ever had before. Right, this sounds familiar. If you've ever had someone explain your own feelings to you in a way that made you doubt your own emotional reality. Jung realized he was documenting something unprecedented in his clinical experience. Wilhelm wasn't just manipulating Anna through lies or coercion, he was consuming her psychological autonomy so completely that she was becoming a psychological extension of Wilhelm rather than her own person. She was losing the ability to experience autonomous emotions, thoughts, or desires. But the pattern extended far beyond Anna. Jung began investigating Wilhelm's workplace, his social circle, his extended family relationships, his business partnerships. What he found was an entire network of people who had all undergone similar transformations to varying degrees, creating what Jung began to think of as a psychological epidemic, with Wilhelm at its center. Wilhelm's business partner, Hans, had been a confident decision-maker when they first began working together, but over the course of 18 months, Hans had become increasingly dependent on Wilhelm's judgment for even minor business decisions. He would present ideas to Wilhelm with apologetic uncertainty, seeking validation for thoughts that had once felt clear and obvious to him. Colleagues in their office building described feeling strangely depleted after meetings with Wilhelm, though they couldn't explain why. They would enter meetings feeling energetic and clear-minded, but leave feeling confused, second-guessing decisions they had felt confident about moments before. Yet they all praised Wilhelm as an exceptional listener who really understood their perspectives. Wilhelm's secretary, Maria, had developed chronic anxiety and insomnia, but she credited Wilhelm with being the only person who truly understood her struggles. She had begun staying late at the office, not because Wilhelm demanded it, but because she felt anxious and confused when away from his clarifying presence. She described feeling like Wilhelm was the only person who could help her make sense of her own thoughts and feelings. Jung began to understand that Wilhelm operated like a psychological virus, spreading through social networks and infecting the emotional autonomy of everyone he encountered. He didn't attack people directly, instead, he gradually convinced them that their own emotional responses were unreliable, that they needed his superior insight to understand themselves correctly. The process was so subtle and felt so helpful that victims typically felt grateful for Wilhelm's intervention in their lives. He would point out patterns in their behavior that they hadn't noticed, offer interpretations of their relationships that seemed profound and insightful, help them understand their own motivations in ways that felt revelatory. But Jung realized that Wilhelm wasn't offering genuine insight, he was installing systematic confusion. By making people doubt their own emotional intelligence and natural intuitive responses, Wilhelm created a dependency that he then exploited to feed his own psychological needs. People began seeking his approval for their feelings, his interpretation of their experiences, his permission to trust their own perceptions. Without realizing what was happening, they handed him control over their inner lives, their decision-making processes, their sense of reality itself. They became psychologically addicted to his validation, while losing touch with their own authentic responses to life. Jung documented case after case of people in Wilhelm's orbit who had lost touch with their authentic selves. They described feeling like actors in their own lives, going through the motions of emotions they could no longer spontaneously access. They had become dependent on Wilhelm's emotional coaching to feel anything genuine, yet they praised him as the most empathetic person they had ever known. The most disturbing part of Jung's investigation was Wilhelm's complete unconsciousness of what he was doing. When Jung attempted to confront him about these patterns, Wilhelm seemed genuinely confused and hurt by the suggestion that he might be harming people. He described himself as someone who cared deeply about helping others understand themselves better, who felt called to serve as a guide for people struggling with emotional confusion. Wilhelm's response to Jung's confrontation revealed the depth of his self-deception. He genuinely believed he was performing acts of love and service. He had no conscious awareness that he was systematically destroying the psychological autonomy of everyone around him. In Wilhelm's mind, he was a healer, a teacher, a compassionate guide, helping lost souls find their way. Jung realized that Wilhelm had no actual self to integrate, develop, or heal. He was a psychological void that maintained the illusion of existence by consuming the authentic selfhood of others like a parasite feeding on life force. Treatment wasn't just difficult, it was literally impossible. You cannot heal someone who has no genuine self to heal, no authentic core to integrate or develop. This led Jung to one of his most disturbing professional realizations. Some individuals develop in such a way that they never establish genuine selfhood. Instead of developing authentic personality, emotions, or individual identity, they learn to maintain the illusion of existence by psychologically parasitizing others. Right, I see them everywhere now. If you're starting to recognize these patterns in people you know, this discovery forced Jung to confront a terrifying question about human nature that would haunt him for the rest of his career. If someone like Wilhelm could exist, appearing normal, even admirable, while systematically destroying the psychological autonomy of others, how many more were out there? How many people were living in relationships, working in organizations, participating in communities, alongside these psychological predators, without ever realizing the danger? Jung began developing what he called recognition protocols, systematic ways to identify these psychological predators before they could establish their hold over vulnerable individuals. Through extensive observation and documentation, he noticed that Wilhelm types shared certain characteristics that could be detected early in relationships if you knew what to look for. The first warning sign was their demonstration of unusual interest in other people's emotional lives combined with a complete inability to share genuine vulnerabilities of their own. Wilhelm types would ask probing questions about your feelings, your fears, your insecurities, your past traumas, your relationship patterns. They seemed deeply interested in understanding your psychological landscape in remarkable detail. But when similar questions were directed at them, they would skillfully deflect with what seemed like profound self-reflection, but was actually elaborate performance. They might share stories about their past that sounded vulnerable, but contained no actual emotional content, no genuine self-revelation, no authentic admission of weakness or uncertainty. The second warning sign was their uncanny ability to mirror whatever emotional response seemed appropriate to any given situation. Their emotional mirroring was sophisticated and convincing, but it was always slightly off, too perfect, too calculated, lacking the organic inconsistency and genuine messiness of authentic human emotion. When genuine people feel sad, their sadness comes with complexity. It might be mixed with anger, tinged with hope, complicated by guilt or confusion. Wilhelm types produced pure textbook emotions that felt somehow artificial, like emotional stock photography, rather than the complex reality of human feeling. The third warning sign was their pattern of collecting emotionally sensitive people as close friends, romantic partners, and professional associates. Wilhelm types seem to instinctively identify and target individuals who felt deeply, who were naturally empathetic, who tended to doubt their own perceptions, who had histories of trauma or emotional sensitivity. They were psychological bloodhounds for emotional richness, drawn to people who had abundant inner lives that could be harvested. They avoided relationships with emotionally flat or psychologically defended people, preferring those who were open, trusting, and prone to self-doubt. The fourth warning sign was the consistent pattern of people around them beginning to show signs of emotional confusion, self-doubt, and psychological dependency. But these changes happened so gradually and felt so much like personal growth or increased self-awareness that they were typically attributed to other causes: stress, life transitions, natural maturation, or the positive influence of the relationship. Victims would describe feeling more self-aware than ever before, more emotionally sophisticated, more psychologically insightful. They would credit the Wilhelm type with helping them understand themselves better, but careful observation revealed that they had actually lost touch with their spontaneous emotional responses and become dependent on external validation for their inner experiences. The fifth warning sign was their maintenance of a public image as exceptionally caring, insightful, or emotionally intelligent individuals. Other people often described Wilhelm types as the most empathetic person they knew, not realizing they were describing a performance rather than authentic feeling. Wilhelm types cultivated reputations as healers, teachers, guides, or exceptionally understanding friends and partners. Jung's protocol for protection was surprisingly simple in concept, but required constant vigilance in practice. The foundation of psychological self-defense against Wilhelm types was learning to trust your own emotional responses, especially when someone else was explaining them to you in ways that contradicted your direct experience. Jung advised paying careful attention to relationships where you found yourself constantly seeking the other person's approval for your emotional reactions, where you began doubting your own perceptions after spending time with them, where you felt confused about your own feelings, despite the relationship seeming to provide clarity and insight. Most importantly, Jung recommended maintaining relationships with people who knew you before you met the potential Wilhelm type. These outside perspectives could serve as reality checks, helping you recognize when your sense of self was being systematically undermined by someone claiming to help you understand yourself better. But Jung's most chilling discovery came when he tried to help Wilhelm's victims recover their authentic selves, after recognizing what had happened to them. Anna had become so psychologically dependent on Wilhelm's interpretations that she experienced severe panic attacks when Jung asked her to identify her own emotions without seeking Wilhelm's guidance first. She had learned to experience herself through Wilhelm's framework so completely that autonomous feeling had become terrifying and foreign. Jung realized that Wilhelm types didn't just damage people temporarily, they created psychologically addictive relationships that were extremely difficult to break. Victims became dependent on the psychological structure their predator provided, even though that structure was slowly destroying their individual identity and capacity for autonomous experience. Recovery required rebuilding basic emotional skills that most people take for granted: the ability to recognize your own feelings without external validation, trust your own perceptions even when others disagreed, maintain your sense of self in relationships without constantly seeking approval or clarification from others. For Anna, this process took several years of intensive work with Jung and required her complete separation from Wilhelm. Even then, she struggled with persistent anxiety about trusting her own emotional responses, and frequently sought Jung's reassurance that her feelings were valid and appropriate. The most disturbing aspect of Anna's recovery was her initial resistance to the process. She experienced Jung's encouragement of her emotional autonomy as cruel and abandoning. Wilhelm had trained her to experience independence as isolation, self-trust as arrogance, emotional autonomy as selfishness. Breaking free felt like losing her connection to love and understanding rather than reclaiming her authentic self. But Wilhelm himself remained completely unchanged throughout this entire process. Jung's attempts at treating Wilhelm revealed that there was quite literally nothing beneath the surface performance. When stripped of his ability to feed on others' emotional energy through his usual manipulation tactics, Wilhelm didn't reveal hidden depths or authentic feelings. He simply became empty, listless, confused, like a computer program running without input data. This led Jung to his most disturbing clinical conclusion: Wilhelm types are not evil in any conscious sense, not motivated by deliberate malice or aware hatred. They simply lack the fundamental capacity for authentic being. They are psychological voids that have learned to maintain the illusion of existence by systematically consuming the authentic selfhood of others. They represent what Jung came to think of as a developmental dead end in human psychology. Individuals who failed to develop genuine identity and instead learned to simulate humanity by feeding on the psychological resources of others. They are not sick in any treatable sense because there is no authentic self present to heal or develop. Jung warned that these individuals represent one of the greatest threats to psychological health in any society. They appear normal, often exceptionally appealing. They integrate seamlessly into communities, workplaces, families, social circles. They are often praised and admired for their apparent emotional intelligence and caring nature. But wherever they go, they leave behind a trail of psychologically depleted people who can't quite explain what happened to them. Their victims often describe feeling like they lost themselves somehow, like they forgot how to trust their own feelings, like they became dependent on someone else's interpretation of their inner life. The Wilhelm case haunted Jung for the rest of his career, and influenced much of his later theoretical work on individuation, authentic development, and psychological integration. He continued studying similar patients throughout his practice, refining his understanding of what he came to call psychological vampirism, the unconscious consumption of others' authentic selfhood by individuals who have no genuine self of their own. Jung's research revealed that Wilhelm types exist in every culture, every historical period, every social and economic class. They are drawn to positions of influence, therapy, teaching, ministry, leadership roles, creative industries, anywhere they can access the inner lives of others while being praised for their apparent wisdom and compassion. In our digital age, Jung's warnings about Wilhelm types have become more relevant and urgent than ever before. Social media platforms and online interactions provide perfect hunting grounds for these psychological predators. They can study and mimic emotional responses without the risk of genuine intimacy or vulnerability. They can collect detailed psychological information about potential victims through carefully crafted online personas, dating apps, professional networking platforms, social media connections, online support groups, virtual therapy sessions. All of these modern phenomena provide unprecedented opportunities for Wilhelm types to identify and target emotionally rich individuals while maintaining their own protective anonymity. The signs Jung identified in 1919 remain exactly the same, but the venues for exploitation have multiplied exponentially. A Wilhelm type can now study your emotional patterns through your social media posts, identify your vulnerabilities through your online activities, and begin their psychological grooming process before ever meeting you in person. They can cultivate an image of perfect empathy and understanding through carefully curated online content, attract victims through apparent shared interests or values, and begin the process of psychological colonization through what feels like meaningful digital connection. Right, I recognize this now. If you've experienced someone who seemed to understand you perfectly online, but left you feeling confused and depleted in real-life interactions, modern Wilhelm types have adapted their techniques to exploit contemporary psychological vulnerabilities. They target people struggling with social media anxiety, online dating fatigue, professional burnout, pandemic isolation, or any of the unique stresses of digital age living. They present themselves as experts in modern psychology, mindfulness, self-improvement, relationship coaching, or spiritual guidance. They offer solutions to specifically contemporary problems, while using the same fundamental techniques Wilhelm used in 1919, gradually undermining their victims' trust in their own emotional responses, while positioning themselves as superior interpreters of inner experience. The consequences of Wilhelm type predation in our hyper-connected world are more severe than ever. Victims can become isolated, not just from their own authentic feelings, but from genuine human connection entirely. They may lose the ability to form relationships that don't follow the predatory pattern they've learned to accept as normal. If you're watching this video, you're already ahead of most people in developing the psychological awareness Jung believed was essential for survival in a world where the most dangerous predators look exactly like the most caring people. You're building the recognition skills that can protect you and people you care about from psychological vampirism. Remember Wilhelm's story not as entertainment, but as a survival guide. Somewhere in your current life, mice at work, in your social circle, in your family, in your romantic relationships, in your online communities, there may be someone who appears exceptionally empathetic, but leaves you feeling somehow depleted, confused about your own emotions, dependent on their interpretation of your inner life. Trust what Jung discovered through his most terrifying case study. The most dangerous people are those who have learned to perfectly mimic human connection while feeling nothing authentic themselves. They walk among us in every community, and learning to recognize them isn't paranoia or cynicism. It's basic psychological self-defense. The Wilhelm types of our world are not monsters in the obvious sense. They don't announce their predatory nature or consciously choose to harm others. They are psychological voids that have learned to simulate humanity by consuming the authentic selfhood of others. They genuinely believe they are loving, caring, insightful people who help others understand themselves better. This makes them infinitely more dangerous than conscious predators, because they inspire no defensive instincts in their victims. Instead, they inspire gratitude, dependence, and psychological addiction. Their victims often defend them fiercely against any suggestion that the relationship might be harmful. Jung's legacy in studying Wilhelm types is his recognition that psychological predation is not about conscious evil, but about the absence of authentic being. The most dangerous people are not those who choose to do harm, but those who lack the capacity for genuine connection and have learned to maintain the illusion of existence by systematically consuming others' psychological resources. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's most dangerous discoveries about human nature. And remember, sometimes the most important knowledge is also the most uncomfortable. Your psychological sovereignty may depend on understanding what Jung learned from Wilhelm Steiner, that some people who claim to love you are actually consuming you, and they don't even know they're doing it. Write in the comments how many of the 5 warning signs you've encountered in your own relationships. Your awareness might save someone else from becoming another victim of psychological vampirism. Share your experiences, but remember to protect your own privacy and the privacy of others. The next video will explore Jung's techniques for rebuilding authentic selfhood after psychological vampirism, because surviving the Wilhelm encounter is only the first step. Recovery requires understanding how to become psychologically untouchable while remaining genuinely human, how to trust your own emotional responses while staying open to real connection. Until then, remember Jung's most important insight from the Wilhelm case: the most terrifying thing is to accept yourself completely, because some people will do everything in their power to prevent you from ever reaching that dangerous level of psychological independence. Your authentic selfhood is a threat to those who have no authentic self of their own. Thanks for watching, and welcome to the dark side of human psychology, where survival requires seeing what others cannot bear to acknowledge, where protection demands recognizing predators who wear the masks of perfect empathy, where freedom means trusting your own inner experience more than anyone else's interpretation of who you are.